Obviously, if you have no bottomless pit, then nothing is ever going to come out of a bottomless pit, including zombie-producing locust scorpion men. And obviously, if the reference in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1 is in fact making a reference to the Roman place of the dead, known in Rome as the catacombs, then that clarifies the intended location of this text, and indirectly its time frame as well. No literal locusts nor scorpions being referred to in these texts, and what is being referred to by these terms and symbolic descriptions are being intentionally hidden from the public, once again, by those very explanations.
These locusts gonna be banging at your windows, and it's all you can do to keep them out. They're gonna be coming out of your faucet. Locusts! Locusts!
When John describes in the language, seeing locusts coming out of the smoke from the abyss, he is describing what he is seeing, not the actual prophecy itself. This is done throughout the book of Revelation, and he usually explains the difference in his texts by making a literal reference after his symbolism, and he does that in chapter 9 as well. John describes them emerging from a natural environment that would be an antithesis to real locusts. This antithesis is part of the prophetic message concerning his vision in verses 1 through 12. You saw in a vision, an orc and pest control man, spraying pesticide to kill roaches, and all of a sudden, out of his spray can, came a stream of roaches. That would not be literal, but it would describe a nightmare scenario. That image is illustrated in John's symbolism, describing locusts coming out of smoke and fire, which is the very thing the ancients used to eliminate them. So John is intentionally attributing characteristics that are uniquely human traits to his description of these symbolic locusts. John further clarifies his intended reference to be symbolical by giving a long list of attributes of human qualities to his symbol of locusts, which literal locusts would be completely incapable of. These references are intended to be understood as symbolism for a human military. There are 3 reasons John invokes the symbolism of locusts in this text. The first reason is how the term is used in the Old Testament, which he is referencing. The second is that is precisely how this very army would actually be described in the future when it actually emerged. And the third reason that John used the term locusts, and possibly the most obvious reason of all, is that that was an extremely accurate visual metaphor for what they actually really looked like. It was known as barding. And when you covered the horse in plate armor, the horse took on the strange appearance of a locust. It literally looked similar to a locust physically. The text mentions another strange detail about this practice of barding, and the physical similarity in appearance to locusts it created on the horses. The plates on the horse were made in smaller movable flaps to give flexibility to the movement of the horse. When these smaller plates were overlapped on the horse, it created the appearance of a feather-like surface. It literally looked like the feathers you see on a bird's wing.
But these are not only swarming, destructive locusts, but they have scorpion's tails.
And if you look, this thing actually has a stinger. Right here. This is a stinger.
You don't want to get stung by one, and I never did, I'm glad to say. But if you do, they say it's really terrible.
But they're going to attack like scorpions. How many here have ever been stung by a scorpion?
The first of these 2 facts is when you discover what is in the text in Revelation chapter 9 that they were trying to hide, and the second fact is when you discover what the former name of these crossbows actually used to be. John makes it clear again to his audience who he is prophesying about, because he says this locust army of Revelation chapter 9 has the power of scorpions, just as our army today has the power of blackhawks and warthogs. And that is what they are hiding about scorpions in Revelation chapter 9.
I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them.
The kind of scorpions they had in Asia Minor and in the Middle East are known by the species name of Androctonus, which is Latin for man-killer. They are also called fat-tail scorpions. And this was the scorpion species that the Roman military weapon was named after, that we just got finished looking at. But John is writing a riddle of contradictions or hypocrisy. They worship death, and never realize it. They desire death, but even death doesn't want to have anything to do with them. Despite the fact they venerated corpses, and spent days and weeks in catacombs and crypts fondling and praying to the dead, precisely as John describes them, they also simultaneously criminalized suicide. It had nothing to do with the magical suspension of all death on planet Earth, no matter what anyone did. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Literally. John points out the hypocrisy that while these men actually worshiped death and the very angel of death was their spiritual king, they also simultaneously criminalized it. If death was so great, why did they criminalize it? John turns the hypocrisy of that contradiction into an insult about them, stating that even the object of their worship and veneration, which was death, wanted nothing to do with them. In fact, John is stating there is going to be quite a bit of death both venerated and created by this army, yet their attitudes and relationships to death, like everything else they will be doing, will be completely contradictory and hypocritical. Because their leader is in reality the Antichrist. Someone who claims to be following Christ, yet replaces him with the angel of Satan, which is the biggest hypocrisy and contradiction of all. And the very identity of that person in these events in history are precisely what the Counter-reformation is actually defending and intentionally hiding from the Christian public, with all these ridiculous distortions based on a medieval worldview of magic, complete with bottomless pits and zombie-producing locust scorpion bugs from the center of the earth, in their explanations of Revelation chapter 9. You have just seen that the term bottomless pit was used to hide the actual term abyss, which in historical context in the New Testament, was a reference to the Roman place of the dead, also known as the catacombs in Rome. You have seen that the reference to locust was invoking a prophecy against an imperial army from Assyria, and was how the Roman Byzantium army was described in terms of their devastation, and how they really actually physically looked with their barded horses. You have seen the reference to scorpions, was a very famous Roman military weapon, which the Vatican actually began calling by the term crossbow because of its identification in Revelation 9. And you saw that the reference that Counter-reformationists take as suspension of death, was really an insult by John over how the Roman Byzantines would venerate and worship death on the one hand, but on the other hand, make it illegal. And so we have seen in our examination of the first three topics, that a very consistent theme is emerging. These prophecies are talking about Rome. Not the end of the world, not Muslims, not aliens from outer space, not liberals, communists, Jews, or a future America, or England, but Rome. Rome's place of burial, Rome's Calvary, and Rome's weaponry. John is still discussing Rome. And he is discussing the future of Rome in context to the future demise of the Nicolaitan city of Antioch, as the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. And how these future events and developments will all spell doom for the Nicolaitan city of Antioch. Now we will look at the last 2 points in our glossary or topical study, which have to do with the first prophecy concerning the first army. These final 2 points are the reference to breastplates of iron and the reference to Apollyon as their king. The 3 last points of our glossary study will have to do with the second army. But these next 2 points end John's discussion of the first army, and as you have just seen, that is precisely what he is discussing. Not fantastical imaginary creatures at the end of the world, or from outer space, or some other dimension. John is discussing a future army of the Roman Empire, under a new military order which he describes in verses 1 through 12. The second army is described by John as God's judgment on this first army, which is as he describes them in verse 1, a Luciferian army, headed by the Antichrist. We will now look at their very unique military armament, referenced by John in verse 9 described as armament made of iron. Why was this unusual and significant? Because armor made of iron was not a step forward into the future of military technology. It was a step backwards. A big step backwards. Iron armor dated backwards into the Iron Age, when iron weapons and armament were cutting-edge military technology. But iron armament had not been used in centuries by Romans, because it was too heavy. And now John is prophesying their breastplates would be made of iron, during this time, in the future. What would cause such a strange custom? John is about to prophesy why this would unexpectedly become the new Roman practice.
They had hair like ribbons here, and the teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots. Many horses were in their path. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in the tails.
And they had breastplates, as it were, breastplates of iron. Didn't say they were iron. It was as if they were iron. Hard shell, though. And the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. You can find people who have experienced these swarms of locusts in the Middle East. The noise is deafening.
But like the hair of women. Their teeth were like the teeth of lions. Can you believe that? You know any locusts like that? Breastplates, as it were, breastplates of iron.
Once again, we come upon a text in Revelation 9 that counter-reformationists resort to ridiculous and incredible literary gymnastics to avoid. As you saw earlier, Counter-Reformation theology practices an amazing feat of completely switching literalisms and symbolisms in chapter 9. And they do so with an amazing degree of precision to achieve an almost exact 180-degree opposite from the text. And here in verse 9, concerning breastplates, you will find them again chasing their own tails, demanding locusts be understood as literal, yet every description about them be understood as symbolic. In order to maintain the claim, the texts are describing literal bugs. Counter-reformationists explain away John's reference in verse 9, in one of four ways. The first way is to just ignore it and draw a literal picture of a breastplate on a locust scorpion man bug, which they fantasize will arise out of their imaginary bottomless pit that goes into the center of the earth. In this version they simply ignore its implications or the required biological logistics of how exactly a bioorganic locust bug would have a non-bioorganic metallic breastplate of iron attached to its biological chest tissue. They just once again leave that to magic, with no explanations needed. The next way they avoid this text is by spiritualizing it or turning it into an ambiguous metaphor, so that it becomes either invisible or non-existent. But there would have been no point in describing it, if it were invisible, because he is describing physical appearances of this army, and the expression in the grammar is not comparative, but specific, as you will soon see. So that claim will not be supported by the explanation of its appearance in the text. The third way they explain it is to claim that that text is a reference to a modern-day bulletproof vests. But the problem with that claim is that Kevlar is exactly opposite of iron. Iron is heavy and Kevlar is light. Kevlar looks like a fabric, and obviously what John is describing is metal, not something that looks like a fabric or a piece of cloth. John is describing the outward surface appearance as not only being clearly metallic, but as made specifically out of iron, a particular type of metal. When you start comparing Kevlar, as used in a bulletproof vest, to iron, you are stretching the description of this text into the absurd. Kevlar is made out of a modern chemical polymer compound, described as a nylon. It is in essence a modern plastic composite compound. Kevlar polymer material is 5 times stronger, per weight, than steel. Iron was not known for its strength at the time of John's writing. There were metallurgical compounds that were lighter and more effective than iron, in the Roman age. In fact, iron was an older metal that had been abandoned for military use because of its weight, at the close of the Iron Age. And as a polymer, Kevlar is definitely without question, non-metallic. In appearance, it is definitely closer to a fabric or a cloth. It is actually organic-based chemistry. Not even related to metal in any way. They might as well be interpreting the text to be a reference to modern t-shirts, or men's dress ties. Their comparison would be just as close or accurate to that text. At that point, using Kevlar to explain the reference in verse 9 to breastplates made of iron, is just making things up. It becomes textual make-believe. And the fourth explanation is to claim that the locust army refers to modern-day Muslims. The last explanation is becoming more and more popular on the internet, with all the conflict and violence being created by pseudo-Muslim, Holy Roman Empire militants, in the Middle East. There are serious problems with all these futurists, counter-reformation claims, which are clearly contradicted and exposed in John's description, in verse 9, concerning breastplates of iron. And in order to solve these problems, all four theological positions will suppress not only the text, but the historical context of that text, in order to keep their claims. In this video, you are about to see what they are intentionally hiding from the public about this text, and its historical background. That is the information that all these alternative explanations have been created to hide. So then, let's take a look, in this video, at what they have been going to such lengths, in order to hide about chapter 9 verse 9. Let's take a look at what they are hiding from you. When we come to the subject of iron breastplates in chapter 9 verse 9, we discover once again, even more evidence of hiding and obstructionism by Counter-reformation preachers and theologians. In chapter 9 verse 9, John writes the following, quote, "They had breastplates as breastplates of iron." End quote. You have already seen in the previous video that the word translated wings is literally the Greek word for feathers. And the feathers John is describing in his vision were the feathered physical appearance created by barding plates on the horses during this period of history. But the Counter-reformation would like you to think all this is about thousands of years in the future. All these texts refer to some strange otherworldly creatures from a bottomless pit. The phrase we are now going to look at is the phrase, quote, "They had breastplates as breastplates of iron." End quote. In verse 9, the literal Greek transliteration of this text is, "And they had breastplates," which were breastplates made of iron. The actual Greek text there says, literally, "made of iron." Not, "like iron," or, "as iron," but, "made of iron." If you will notice in most of your translations into English, they will not reflect the strength of that Greek expression describing the breastplates as made of iron when translating verse 9. Ironically, the contemporary English version does a better job of translating this text than most other translations. There the contemporary English version translates the text as, quote, "On their chests they wore armor made of iron." End quote. The Greek word translated by the word, as, or the phrase, as it were, is the Greek word, hos, and means literally, which how, or, in the manner of. But we do not say, which how, in modern English. We say, which were, or, which are, specifying the kind, class or type of object, depending on the verbal tense. But the point is, the phrase, which how, is a specification of class or type. It is not a comparative metaphor. This is something that every Counter-reformation preacher who has preached on this text has seen for themselves. But that information is never passed on to their audience. In fact, to the contrary, it is actually intentionally withheld. The phrase in the Greek is not a comparative metaphor to iron, it is literally a specification by John that it is made of iron. And thus, why you see in the contemporary English translation the corrected reading, "On their chests they wore armor made of iron." This is an important detail because this specification rules out the reference as likeness to iron in the comparative sense. Meaning that when Counter-reformationists apply this text to make reference to modern-day bulletproof vests made out of Kevlar, they are actually violating the grammar of the text. The material these breastplates are made out of is specified to be iron. Not like iron, but actually iron. It is a specification, not a metaphorical comparison. The raw Greek text is pretty clear on its intended reference to iron. Not as a simile, comparison or a metaphor, but as an actual description or specification of what the breastplates were actually literally made of. And John is describing those breastplates as made out of iron. Naturally, that creates a problem for Counter-reformationists. Iron is a very heavy metal, and because of this, it is not used in modern armament at all. It is an antiquated metallic material because of the fact it is heavy. And every Counter-reformationist preacher on TV knows, the only way you can get that reference to refer to anything in the future at all, is to turn it into a comparative metaphor, and make it refer to something else. The only problem of course is that when they do that, knowing the text is not comparative, they are intentionally lying to the public. In the name of Christ. That is a very strange thing, don't you think? What would motivate a preacher to make a career out of lying to the public about a text in the Bible? You are about to find out, in the next section on having Apollyon as their king. As you just saw, John specifies that the material these breastplates are made from is iron. So what was it that John was actually prophesying about these breastplates, which were going to be made from iron? We are going to have to do a little bit of language detective work again on our English terminology in this text. because ancient Greeks and Romans did not speak English. And our English words often bury the clarity and specificity of what our biblical authors were trying to communicate to their readers. Sometimes things get lost in translation, and we have another shade of meaning that is lost in our English text. The singular and plural form of the Greek word breastplates only occurs 4 times in the New Testament. 2 usages are in Revelation chapter 9, and 2 usages are by Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12 and in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 8. Paul's 2 uses of the term use comparative metaphorical language, where he instructs the Ephesians to put on the breastplate of righteousness. There, Paul makes a reference to this Roman armament in a clearly comparative metaphorical sense. Despite his metaphorical usage, however, he is referring to the same thing John refers to in Revelation, both using the same Greek word. And Paul, having been placed under arrest and constant guard by Roman soldiers, was making a comparison to something he noticed about their body armor equipment, which he draws a spiritual lesson from for his readers. But in Revelation 9, John is describing a physically observable appearance as a part of his prophecy. And as you have seen in the 3 previous topics we have examined so far, every reference John has made in this chapter, in regard to this first army, involve references to things which were clearly Roman. This reference is going to prove to be perfectly consistent with the other previous 4 topics we have already looked at. Both Paul and John were referring to a piece of military body armor, worn specifically by Roman soldiers, in their direct historical environment. So that's the first thing we should notice. The second thing is where our language detective work begins. The term in the Greek, translated as breastplate, is the Greek word theorokos, or therox, and was the word used in the ancient world to refer to what is now referred to as a corselet in English, as you see in the Strong's Greek lexicon reference. Are corselets and breastplates synonymous? What is a corselet? Here's where things begin to get interesting. A corselet is a little more complex than simply a breastplate. Which is quite ironic, because when you see the cartoon illustrations by counter-reformationists showing their locust, scorpion, horse, bug men with the breastplates on their chest, they usually depict a plate of metal on the chest of a bug and think that suffices to visually illustrate this text. But you can throw that image completely out, because you are not looking at what Paul and John referred to by the Greek term theorokos, and translated as breastplate. The term translates to the English word corselet, and refers to the covering that covers the entire upper half of the body, both on the front and back. Not simply a plate of metal on the chest. The English word corselet itself was coined in the 1500s by the manufacturer of Osmond iron, speaking of iron, whose name was actually corselet, and who made this kind of armament in England, which the English then named it after. In much the same way people will often use brand names today to refer to generic product categories, such as the word Coke to refer to sodas, or a Xerox to refer to a photocopy. But there was a word for this kind of armament before the English brand word corselet was coined in England in the 1500s. And that is the word we must find. What was this thing called before the English word corselet was coined? Here is where our detective work begins. In Luke chapter 23 verse 38 and in John chapter 19 verse 20, we read about the crucifixion of Christ. And that a sign was placed over Christ in 3 languages: Greek, Latin and Hebrew. The sign was in Hebrew for the Jews who spoke Hebrew, but it was in Greek and Latin, because those were the 2 languages of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a bilingual empire. The Roman Empire was actually a merger of half of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. That is why historians often use the term Greco-Roman Empire to refer to it. In southern Italy, most of the influences were Greek. In northern Italy, they were Latin. So when these 2 regions merged to form a single empire, it was referred to as the Greco-Roman Empire. The New Testament was written in Greek, but often you will find Greek words used in the New Testament that refer to Latin and Hebrew things. Just as you saw on the sign written above Christ at his crucifixion. When Greek texts in the New Testament refer to Jewish things in the Old Testament, you have to examine the words in Hebrew. But when the Greek text in the New Testament refers to secular Roman history, you have to examine those things in the Latin language, precisely as the sign was written above Christ's crucifixion. Greek, Hebrew, and Latin are all involved in understanding the New Testament in historical context. And this is what we find in the use of the Greek term, the locust, which means corselet in English. But both Paul and John's references were referring to something worn by Roman soldiers in their day who spoke Latin and called it something in Latin. So in other words, all four references in the New Testament referred to military equipment known by Paul and John, which were worn on Roman soldiers. All four references in the New Testament. They weren't referring to something imaginary or completely unknown in the future. They were referring to something which was being worn on a Roman soldier who spoke Latin, because the official language of the Roman Empire was Latin. So both John and Paul were referring to something that actually had a name in Latin and was worn on Roman soldiers, even though they were writing in Greek. So what were they referring to? They weren't referring to an English corselet. So, what was it they were referring to that they saw on Roman soldiers in their day? That John prophesies in the future when the Antichrist comes will be made out of iron? And it wasn't in 96 AD? If you type in the English word corselet into Google Translate from English to Latin, you will see that it translates to the Latin word lorica. You can verify this is correct by looking up this same text in the Latin Vulgate to see how it was translated into Latin. And there, precisely as our modern Google Translate gives us, we find the Greek word, lorikos, was translated into Latin as the very same Latin word, lorica. This is very important because it means that what we are looking for in Roman history will be found under the name, lorica, not under the English words, corselet, or breastplate. We are looking into the history of something called a lorica in Latin. Both John and Paul were referring to a Latin lorica, which was worn by Roman soldiers. John was actually making a reference to something in his text that we have translated into English as breastplates. But John was describing the locust in the Greek language to refer to something Roman, which would be referred to in Latin as a lorica in the Roman language, precisely as we see translated in the Latin Vulgate and in our modern Google Translate. So now we have discovered that we are not looking at an English breastplate, but a Roman lorica. And there is a major difference between the English concept of a breastplate and an actual Roman lorica. The New Testament writers, John and Paul, were both referencing the Roman lorica, not the English concept of a breastplate. That clarification is a major breakthrough when researching what John was prophesying. Without that clarification, you really don't even have the faintest clue what he was even actually prophesying about. An error you will see constantly illustrated in the cartoon illustrations showing the Counter-reformation explanation of Revelation 9 of fantastical locust scorpion horsebug men with little metal plates on their chest from a non-existent bottomless pit. Next, we have to consider two dates of reference for this text. One date is John's date of writing, which was around 96 AD. And the other date is the time frame of the first astronomical event, marking the rise of the first army, which he compares to locusts and scorpions, which we covered in the previous video. At the time that John wrote this text, Rome did not make their military armament, the Roman lorica, out of iron. Roman lorica, or lorikos in Greek, in John's day, were made out of bronze, nor were they made out of iron any time around 70 AD. So he was not making a reference to 70 AD, as you hear some preterists try and argue these texts. In order to completely dismiss the subject of the Antichrist as referring to Nero or some other temporary secular Roman entity in 70 AD. There were no Roman lorica made out of iron in 70 AD, so this text could not refer to anything in that period of history. And since John specified the material of iron, John was not referring to anything in modern armies, as premillennialists try to argue. John is singling out an entire specific era of history, consistent with his earlier reference to his astronomically dated time frame, that with this reference simply cannot be honestly missed by anyone. And this very specific reference to developments in Roman military armament eliminates all the other fictitious and substitute Counter-reformation time frames from Revelation chapter 9, whether it be in 70 AD or at the end of the world. because we know precisely when Rome began actually using, quote, the locust, or Roman lorica, made of iron, end quote. We know precisely when this occurred. It is fully and completely known in history. And therefore, so is the time frame for this prophecy. And that is precisely what the Counter-reformation is trying to keep hidden from the public concerning breastplates, as it were, of iron. This is what the cat and mouse game is all about. The Encyclopedia Americana, speaking of the Roman lorica, explains, quote, under the Roman Republic all the legionaries wore a bronze cuirass, consisting of a breast and back plate, with a border of pendant leather straps, defending the lower part of the body. End quote. Polybius, a Greek historian, describes Roman lorica as, quote, a bronze plate, measuring a span every way, which they wear on their chests, and call a heart guard. End quote. The Roman lorica was a very uniquely Roman, signature piece of military equipment. Romans were not the only ones in the ancient world to use body armor, but the Romans were the only ones that used a uniform military standard for it in their army. And they were the first to invent what John was prophesying in Revelation chapter 9 verse 9. Shortly after the prophecy written by John in 96 AD, a new standard of military armament appeared for the design and manufacturing of the Roman lorica. It was called the lorica segmentata. The lorica segmentata was an important innovation in Roman military technology, and would soon become the signature image of a Roman soldier. It is so uniquely Roman, the image of this equipment is often used in Hollywood movies, in anachronistic ways, to depict Roman soldiers. The word anachronistic means out of place within the time frame. For years, whenever Hollywood wanted to depict a Roman soldier in any movie, they would automatically dress him in a lorica segmentata, no matter what the time period, because it was such a unique hallmark of the Roman army. The lorica segmentata literally became synonymous in history with the Roman soldier. The lorica segmentata was a huge step forward in armament, because it was made up of solid plates which hung together around the vital organ region of the upper body. But that was not what made the lorica segmentata so unique. The material which was used for it was smelted in a totally new way, so that the outer surface of the material became substantially harder than anything before, requiring less metal material. This smelting technology involved represented the earliest stages of modern steel production in history. And the metal that the Roman army began doing this with was none other than a retrograde return to the use of iron. That's right. It was made of iron. Precisely as John had prophesied in Revelation chapter 9, verse 9. They were breastplates, or as it says in the Latin Vulgate, lorica, made of iron. Literally. This text was literally fulfilled in history. And its fulfillment was unmistakable. When Counter-reformationists wish to shift this text to other places and times in history, or way into the future, they are facing a momentous task. Because this development in history is so uniquely Roman, there is no way to honestly avoid this reference as an identification intended by John to refer to the Roman army. The lorica segmentata was not used by any other people, any other armies, or any other period of history, other than precisely the very place and time John was prophesying in the Roman Empire. Muslims did not wear lorica segmentatas, and would not discover steel armament for another 1,000 years. They used light materials intended to give their soldiers speed and flexibility, and keep them cool, because of the hot desert climates most of them would be fighting in. This material has long since been replaced in modern armies by materials which are much more flexible and impenetrable, such as the polymer Kevlar. So this reference creates another unmistakable reference to Rome in history. And the record of the fulfillment of this prophecy has been permanently carved into stone in the very city of Rome, in one of its most famous monuments, having to do with John's very prophecy from Revelation chapter 9. When Constantine's triumphant arch was built in Rome to commemorate his victory over Maxentius at Milvian Bridge, his soldiers are shown wearing John's prophesied lorikos, or Roman lorica, made of iron, the lorica segmentata, translated as breastplates, and his very victory over Maxentius at Milvian Bridge, with these words on his arch: Imperatori Caesari Flavio Constantino, Maximo Pio Felici, Augusto Senatus Populus, Q Romanus quod instincta divinitatis, mentis magnitudine, cum exercita suotam de tyranno quam de omniibus factioni, anno temporistis, republicam altus est armis, arcum triumphus insmam diquit. To the Emperor Caesar Flavius Constantinus, the greatest, pious, and blessed Augustus, because he, inspired by the divine, and by the greatness of his mind, has delivered the state from the tyrant and all of his followers at the same time, with his army and just force of arms, the Senate and people of Rome have dedicated this arch, decorated with triumphs. The words on the arch, instincta divinitatis, meaning, inspired by the divine, has been taken by both secular and church historians, including Eusebius, as a reference to the beginning of what would become the papal, Holy Roman Empire, under Constantine the Great, in 315 AD. The very same year, John targets with this astronomical dating for Revelation chapter 9, verse 1. And you will see much more about this when we exegete this chapter, after we finish these topical studies. John's prophecy in Revelation 9 was accurate to the year of these momentous events in human history. And his prophecy about the military-wearing Roman lorica, being made out of iron, was also fulfilled in these very events, precisely as he describes. And this is what the Counter-reformation has been hiding from the public, about breastplates made of iron. Another reason you know this information was and is known to Counter-reformation theologians and preachers is how the Greek words, the rockas, and the rocks, has been applied in the English language to things in medicine and science. There, you will see a clear residual effect of its relationship to the Latin, lorica segmentata. When you type in the English word, thorax into Google Translate, you will see that it translates into the same Greek word that is found in the New Testament, the rockas and the rocks. When you look up the English word, thorax, which is actually the Greek word simply transliterated into English, this Greek word is used in English, in two ways, both having to do with anatomy. The first use is in medical anatomy, to refer to the rib cage. And as you can see, the rib cage is wrapped around the entire body and is segmented by the ribs, and looks very much like the lorica segmentata. It does not refer to the plate in the front of the rib cage, which is called the sternum, but it is used to refer to the entire rib cage. And as you can see, this primary application of the term thorax in medical science much more closely resembles the structure of the lorica segmentata than it does a single breastplate, which would have been used to refer to the sternum instead. The second use in English is an extension of that medical use in anatomy, and is found in entomology in the study of insects, arachnoids and crustaceans, and is used to refer to the section of exoskeleton on an insect or crustacean, between the head and the body, which has exoskeletal ridges, or plate sections. For example, this rigid section on a locust, in entomology, is actually referred to as the thorax. This is literally the same Greek word we find used in the New Testament in Revelation chapter 9 verse 9. The base of the locust is called its stigmata. Both in entomology and anatomy, the way the English scientific term thorax is used is to refer to things which resemble not a single plate that is put on the chest, but to the same section between the neck and the body as in the human rib cage, not always, but usually, consisting of a segmented exoskeletal region of their anatomy, in insects or crustaceans. If thorax simply referred to a single plate on the chest, the scientific application of the term in medicine would not be referring to the whole rib cage in anatomy, or to the rigid sections of exoskeletons, in insects, in entomology. It would be used to refer to a single front plate section on the chest, corresponding to the sternum in skeletal anatomy. Which of course, it doesn't. It refers to the segmented rib cage of mammals, or usually, the segmented plates on exoskeletons. The invention of plate armor by the Roman military was significant enough to affect the course of history.
At the end of the 1st century AD, the soldier Tiberius Claudius Vitalis crossed the river Danube and reached the end of the world. trained to obey, he went. In the war to come, victory would hang upon such discipline. The greatest weapon of the greatest army the world had yet seen. After weeks of cutting trees and building forts, the legionaries relished the chance to fight. Tiberius went into combat better armored than any soldier of his day. The mail worn by his predecessors had been replaced by the lorica segmentata, a breastplate of metal sheets connected by hooks and straps and conforming to his joints. When he moved, so did his armor, unless rusted by rain. His iron helmet protected his face and neck without obscuring his vision.
It provided an overwhelming strategic advantage in close arms combat to the Roman soldier on the early medieval battlefield. And as you have probably noticed by now, the appearance of the Roman segmented plate armament, made of iron, looks strikingly similar to an insect's exoskeleton. A similarity which was not missed on John's comparison to locusts. As mentioned earlier, not only was Rome's most renowned offensive weapon named the scorpion, not only did the comparison of locusts invoke the locust prophecy involving Assyria, not only did it match the descriptions of indiscriminate devastation by Roman historians, not only did it match the physical appearance of the barded cavalry, but even the lorica segmentata made of iron itself echoed the appearance of an insect's exoskeleton. And John's reference to the coming lorica segmentata, made specifically out of the metal of iron, leave his reference in Revelation chapter 9 verse 9, without any reasonable doubt. These were all things that together were absolutely unique to the Roman military in the ancient world. And if there were not enough already, on top of all these things, there is one last thing, on top of all these others, that really puts John's reference beyond any remaining honest debate. One last thing, the Counter-reformation keeps hidden about the lorica segmentata. This is what this armor allowed the Roman infantry to do in battle maneuvers. Using this armor in close combat.
Cut the others free! Hold the circle! Close the circle! Defensive circle!
Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? Is a better home waiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky? Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? Is a better home waiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky?
You have seen in this video that the reference to breastplates made of iron in Revelation chapter 9 verse 9 actually mean iron. It is not a metaphor or simile in the text. It doesn't refer to modern nylon Kevlar made of plastic, or Muslims, or a generic invisible spiritual principle. And you have seen also that Counter-reformation theology does an exact reverse switch on what is symbolic and what is literal in Revelation chapter 9, intentionally confusing the two roles of the language within the text. And you have seen that in order to get this text into the distant future from John's day, Counter-reformation theology requires either ignoring it or symbolizing it out of relevance. Because that reference dates this chapter historically to a definite place and time in history. That place being Rome, and that time being the historic emergence of the Holy Roman Empire into Western civilization. And you have seen that John's references to the Roman locust segmentata, which he actually prophesied would be made of iron, are cloaked under references to ambiguous and inaccurate terms, such as breastplates and corselets, in our standard English translations. Both words, which are clearly anachronistic terms to John's time of writing. Breastplates being much earlier, and corselets, like crossbows, a term which comes much later. You have also seen that John's prophecy that the locust would be made out of iron, during the time he is prophesying about in Revelation chapter 9 verses 1 through 12, was accurate and has been carved into stone, in one of Rome's most famous monuments for all time and posterity to see, including the Counter-reformation itself. In historical fact, they simply hide from their audiences when they explain the book of Revelation to the public. And once again, you see that very clear historically contexted references in the book of Revelation, referring to the Roman Empire, are simply hidden from the public, and replaced with things that are known inaccuracies, or simply put, lies and disinformation. You saw this with the term abyss making reference to the Roman catacombs. You saw this with the term crossbow, in order to hide the name of scorpion, and now you see it again, with the ambiguous term breastplate, to refer to the Roman locust segmentata. And you have seen in earlier videos in this series, that this pattern of hiding the truth and suppression of information and obstructionism, begins in Counter-reformation theology, with even the earliest texts found in the book. From God's throne in the sky, which is actually positioned horizontally, rather than vertically, to the very meaning of terms and words themselves, such as the Greek term gaze for land, which they constantly refer to as the whole world, or such common terms as angels, stars, and tritons or triads. But all of this lying, suppression, and obstructionism will pale in comparison to what is coming next. In the next topic we will expose everything you have seen so far will be proved to be minuscule in comparison to what you are about to see concerning the next topical reference. They had Apollyon as their king, in verse 11. In this one text, you will see John prophesy within the space of one small sentence, a death blow to everything the Counter-reformation is attempting to accomplish, by hiding all these things from the public. In just one short verse, John will expose one of history's greatest deceptions, and he will do it before it even begins. Thus why today, that same deception is so dependent on lying to the public and spreading disinformation concerning the book of Revelation to accomplish its religious and political purposes. Purposes which John identifies as the Antichrist. This concludes our topical study on the term, breastplates of iron, from Revelation chapter 9 verse 9. In the next video we will look at the final topic involving John's description of the first army in Revelation chapter 9. And the phrase, they had Apollyon as their king. If you think you have learned something shocking in the previous 12 videos, you are about to discover What is the hidden nuclear core of the entire Counter-reformation movement, and what it has literally spent billions of dollars on, and centuries of propaganda on, in order to actually hide from the public, and which now, in post-Reformation Europe and America, now constitutes the majority of all religious institutionalism in the Western world. Be prepared to be amazed at what you will discover next. Thank you for watching.